The bacon was perfect that November morning. Crispy edges, salt crystals, catching the light from the mess hall windows. Robert Crawford sat alone at the corner table, his fork pausing midair, as he stared through the glass at the shape waiting in Hangar 7. Silver gray metal, red stars, enemy markings that were supposed to mean something different now. Steam rose from his coffee cup. Black, no sugar, the way his father taught him. The way men drank it in steel mills and factories in the engine shops where Crawford had spent 20 years learning that American engineering was supposed to be the best in the world. Wright Field, Ohio, November 7th, 1945, 6:15 in the morning. 14 days. That's what the telegram from Washington said. 14 days to prove American superiority or watch his career disappear like smoke from his coffee cup. The letter from his son lay folded beside his plate. Crawford had read it 3 times already. Tommy's handwriting confident and clear. 19 years old, engineering student at Purdue. Smart kid, proud kid, maybe too proud. Crawford took another bite of bacon. It tasted like every breakfast since the war ended, like abundance, like victory, like certainty. But the Soviet fighter waiting 200 yards away was about to teach him that certainty was just another word for ignorance wearing a uniform. He didn't know it yet, but in 10 days he'd be standing in that hangar, oil dripping from his fingers, breathing in a smell that would destroy everything he thought he knew about engines. A smell of medicine, a smell of childhood, a smell that had no business being anywhere near a fighter aircraft that helped bring down the Third Reich. The smell of castor oil, but that moment was still coming. Right now, Crawford was just a man eating bacon, drinking coffee, reading his son's letter one more time, and trying to convince himself that the next 2 weeks would confirm what he already believed. That America built better because America thought better. That Soviet technology was crude imitation at best. That the fighter plane with the red star was primitive, lucky, nothing more. He was wrong about all of it. Crawford pushed his plate away. The bacon was cold now anyway. He picked up Tommy's letter, unfolded it slowly, and read the words again, even though he had them memorized. Dear Dad, Professor Henderson lectured on Soviet technology today. He says they won with numbers, not innovation. Their equipment is crude copies of Western designs at best. He showed us photos of T-34 tanks. The welding looks rough, he said, like farmers' work. It makes me proud. We Americans build better because we think better design, better innovate better. I'm following in your footsteps, Dad. Crawford folded the letter and tucked it into his breast pocket. His coffee had gone cold too. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, burning off the morning frost, illuminating the red stars on that Soviet fighter's wings. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered a question he didn't want to hear. What if Professor Henderson was wrong? What if crude didn't mean stupid? What if rough welding was just different? Welding optimized for different conditions. Crawford stood up. His chair scraped against the linoleum floor. The mess hall was starting to fill with morning shift workers, their voices low and tired, their coffee cups clattering against saucers. He walked to the window, pressed his palm against the cold glass. Hangar 7 stood there like a challenge, like a test he might fail. Colonel James Mitchell had called the meeting for 0700, 11 men, hand-picked, the best aircraft engineers America had to offer. Their job was simple. Take apart the Soviet La-7 fighter. Document everything. Prove that American engineering was superior. Write a report that would convince Washington that the Soviets were no threat, technologically speaking. 2 weeks, 14 days. Then the fighter would be shipped to a museum somewhere labeled as a curiosity, a relic of a war already fading into history books. Crawford turned away from the window. He needed more coffee. He needed to clear his head. He needed to stop thinking about his son's letter and start thinking like an engineer. But the bacon smell lingered in the mess hall. Rich, fatty, American. And Crawford couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to learn the difference between abundance and wisdom. The hangar doors were already open when Crawford arrived 20 minutes later. Cold November air mixed with the smell of oil and metal and something else he couldn't identify yet. The smell that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The team was assembling. 11 men standing in a loose semicircle around the Soviet fighter, coffee cups in hand, breath visible in the cold morning air. Thomas Hayes arrived first. 38 years old, MIT aerodynamics expert. drinking his coffee like it was medicine he didn't enjoy but knew he needed. He looked at the La-7 the way a man might look at a puzzle that offended him just by existing. Wood and fabric haze muttered to nobody in particular. In 1945, this is what they consider advanced. David Stein came next. 31, metallurgy specialist. Jewish. His family had fled Europe in 38, 3 steps ahead of the camps. He didn't say anything about the Soviet fighter, just stood there staring at it, his coffee cup held in both hands like he was trying to warm something deeper than his fingers. Derek Williams showed up eating a glazed donut, powdered sugar on his lips, confidence radiating from him like heat from an engine. 26 years old, Wright Aeronautical. Top of his class, the kind of young engineer who believed the textbooks more than he believed his own eyes. Soviet junk, Derek said around a mouthful of donut. We'll have it figured out by lunch, prove they're 20 years behind us. Easy job. Then Charles Morgan walked in, and the temperature in the hangar seemed to drop another 10 degrees. 52 years old, flew in the Great War, sop with camels over France, 47 missions. Came home with medals and nightmares and a reputation for knowing when young men were about to make fatal mistakes. Morgan didn't drink coffee. He just stood there in his worn leather jacket, looking at the La-7 like he was looking at a ghost. I've seen men underestimate simple machines, Morgan said quietly. The graveyards are full of them. Derek stopped chewing his donut. Colonel Mitchell arrived at exactly 0700, 51 years old, career officer, Pentagon promotion waiting if this project succeeded. If it failed, he'd spend the rest of his career pushing papers in some forgotten office in Oklahoma. Mitchell carried a folder thick with intelligence reports. He set it down on a workbench with a sound that echoed in the cold hangar. Gentlemen, Mitchell said, Polish pilots brought this La-7 over 2 weeks ago. Captain Jerzy Kowalski, good man, flew 47 missions against the Germans, chose freedom over going back east. This fighter is his gift to us, his way of saying thank you to America. Mitchell opened the folder, pulled out photographs, black and white images of La-7s in formation over Berlin. Spring of 45. The final battles. The Germans called it the Farmer's Plain. Mitchell continued, wood construction, fabric covering, looked primitive to them, then it killed them by the thousands. He laid out more photographs, crashed Focke-Wulfs, burned Messerschmitts, German pilot testimonies captured after surrender. Combat record, Mitchell said, tapping one particular document, 680 kilometers per hour at ground level, 1,000 meters per minute climb rate, 320 millimeter cannons. And this one, gentlemen, this one is the interesting part. He held up a photograph, a Soviet pilot standing next to a La-7, young face, hard eyes, the kind of eyes men get when they've seen too much death too young. Ivan Kozhedub, Mitchell said, Soviet ace. Flew one of these, spring of 45. Engaged 2 Messerschmitt 262s, jet fighters, 870 kilometers per hour capability. This man flying this piston engine fighter shot down one of them. Impossible, Derek said. That's propaganda. Mitchell looked at him. It's confirmed by German records. The jet was too fast for its own pilot. Couldn't maneuver tight enough. Kozhedub used this fighter's turn rate and put cannon rounds through the 262's engines. The German ejected. Survived. Told his debriefers exactly what happened. The hangar went quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the open doors. Crawford set his coffee cup down on the workbench, walked closer to the La-7. The morning sun was coming through the hangar doors, now illuminating the fighter from the side, casting shadows that made the red stars look like wounds in the metal. Wood, Crawford said, running his hand along the wing root. Pine, probably, covered with fabric. But the precision. He pressed harder, feeling the structure underneath. This isn't crude. This is calculated. Hayes joined him, pulled out a measuring tape, started checking tolerances. His coffee sat forgotten on the workbench, getting cold. Derek finished his donut, wiped his hands on his pants, walked around the other side of the La-7, looking for flaws, looking for proof of inferiority, looking for anything that would confirm what his professors had taught him. Stein stood apart from the others, looking at the red stars, thinking about his family, thinking about the fact that this Soviet fighter had helped defeat the same enemy that had murdered everyone he loved. Morgan just watched, hands in his pockets, quiet, seeing things the younger men couldn't see yet. Mitchell cleared his throat. 14 days, gentlemen. Washington wants actionable intelligence. They want to know if Soviet aviation is a threat. They want to know if we should take them seriously or if they just got lucky with this one design. He paused. Let that sink in. My promotion depends on this report, Mitchell continued. Crawford's reputation depends on it. But more importantly, America's strategic assessment of the Soviet Union depends on it. We're entering a new kind of war, a Cold War, and we need to know what we're dealing with. Crawford turned away from the La-7, looked at Mitchell. And if we find out they're better than us in some ways, then we learn from it, Mitchell said. And we get better ourselves. Derek made a sound halfway between a laugh and a cough. They're not better. Look at this thing. My kid could build a better fighter out of balsa wood. Morgan spoke without looking at Derek. Your kid doesn't have to build a fighter while his country is being invaded, while factories are being bombed, while half the skilled workers are dead or fighting on the front. These engineers built this with whatever they had. And it worked. That should terrify you, son, because it means they're smart enough to do more with less. The hangar went quiet again. Mitchell picked up his folder. First priority is external examination. Document everything. Measurements, materials, construction methods, photography from every angle. We start disassembly in 5 days. Questions. When do we open the engine? Crawford asked. Day 7, Mitchell said. That's when we'll find out what makes this thing really tick. Crawford felt something cold move through his chest. Not fear exactly. More like anticipation mixed with dread. The engine was always where the real secrets lived. The morning passed in a blur of measurements and photographs and coffee that never stayed hot long enough. Crawford worked methodically documenting the fuel system. 3 tanks, simple plumbing, no unnecessary complexity, every connection accessible. Every valve clearly marked in Cyrillic letters that looked alien but weren't stupid. The electrical system surprised him. 28 volts instead of the American standard 12. Heavier wiring, more robust connections. At first glance, it looked over-engineered. Then Crawford understood. Arctic conditions, minus 40 Celsius starts. The heavier system wasn't wasteful, it was necessary. Each wire was labeled with permanent paint markings. No paper tags that could fall off. No metal plates that could corrode. Just paint. Simple. Permanent. Field maintainable. Crawford made notes. Tried to stay objective. Tried not to see the genius in every small decision. Lunch came and went. Sandwiches and potato chips from the mess hall. Coca-Cola in glass bottles. The teammates standing up, not wanting to leave the hangar, not wanting to miss anything. Derek was getting quieter. The more he looked at the La-7, the less certain he seemed. The wood construction that looked primitive from a distance revealed itself to be precisely engineered when examined up close. Every joint reinforced, every stress point calculated. Nothing accidental, nothing crude. Hayes was working on the wing profile, taking measurements every few inches, plotting them on graph paper. His hands moved mechanically, but his face showed confusion. The numbers didn't match what he expected. The profile was too good, too efficient, designed by someone who understood aerodynamics at a level that made Hayes uncomfortable. Stein found something in the landing gear. The steel forgings were simple in appearance, but extraordinarily strong. Tested one in the machine shop. It withstood forces that should have bent it. The metallurgy was different from American standards, but not inferior. Just different. Optimized for different manufacturing constraints. Morgan spent most of the day just watching, observing how the team reacted, seeing their certainties slowly erode. He'd been through this before, in another war, with different machines. The lesson was always the same. Underestimate your enemy and he'll kill you. Respect him and you might survive. The sun was setting when Mitchell called for a briefing. The team gathered in a corner of the hangar. Someone had brought more coffee. It tasted like burnt promises. Findings, Mitchell said. Hayes spoke first. The wing profile is exceptional, better than expected. Whoever designed this understood laminar flow at an advanced level. The fabric covering should create more drag than metal, but the profile compensates. At low altitude, this wing is as good as anything we've built. Maybe better. Stein went next. The materials are different from our standards. Not worse, different. The steel alloys are optimized for different properties. Less chromium, more molybdenum. Result is slightly lower tensile strength, but much better impact resistance. For a fighter operating from rough fields, getting shot at, it's a smart trade-off. Crawford reported on systems. Everything is maintainable in field conditions. Simple tools, minimal training. A mechanic who can fix a truck could probably keep this fighter flying. That's deliberate. That's design philosophy. Derek didn't report. He just stood there holding his coffee cup, staring at the floor. Mitchell looked at him. Williams, your assessment. Derek raised his head. His confidence from this morning was gone, replaced with something that looked like respect mixed with embarrassment. I was wrong, Derek said. This isn't crude. This is optimized for conditions we never considered. We designed for peacetime depot maintenance. They designed for wartime field maintenance. We design assuming abundant resources. They designed assuming scarcity. We're solving different problems. And they solved theirs better than we solved ours. The hangar was quiet except for the sound of wind outside. Mitchell closed his folder. Tomorrow we continue. I want complete documentation of every system before we start disassembly. Day after tomorrow, we begin removing external components. Day 7, we open the engine. He paused. His voice dropped lower. That engine is the heart of this machine. That's where we'll find the real answers. Get some sleep, gentlemen. We've got a long 2 weeks ahead. The team dispersed slowly, Hayes carefully rolling up his graph paper. Stein checking his metallurgy samples one more time. Derek walking out without saying anything to anyone. Crawford stayed behind, standing next to the La-7, running his hand along the fuselage. The metal was cold now. The sun had set completely. The hangar lights cast shadows that made the red stars look darker. Morgan appeared beside him. 2 old men in a cold hangar, looking at a machine that was teaching them things they didn't want to learn. Can't sleep, Morgan asked. Crawford pulled Tommy's letter from his pocket, unfolded it, read the words again, even though he had them memorized. My son thinks we're the best because we're Americans, Crawford said. He thinks Soviet technology is crude because his professors tell him so. I taught him to be confident. Now I'm wondering if I taught him to be arrogant. Morgan was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice soft, almost lost in the cold air. I flew in the Great War. Gnome rotary engines. Larone, they ran on castor oil. The same stuff your mother gave you when you were sick. Medicine cabinet oil. Crawford looked at him. It was crude, Morgan continued. Leaked everywhere, smelled terrible. We thought we were modern, advanced, best in the world. Then after the war, we moved to petroleum oils, synthetics, better performance on paper. We abandoned castor oil, called it primitive. Morgan touched the La-7's propeller blade. Cold metal rang softly. Germans thought Soviets were primitive too. Thought T-34 tanks were crude. Thought Soviet planes were farmers' tools. Then Stalingrad happened, then Kursk, then Berlin. He turned to look at Crawford. You know what primitive means? It means we don't understand it yet. Crawford felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening in a room he didn't know existed. This engine we're going to open in a few days, Morgan said. It might teach us that everything we think we know is just everything we haven't questioned yet. They stood there in the cold hangar, 2 men on the edge of learning something that would change them. Crawford could almost smell it already. That sweet medicinal smell he couldn't identify. The smell that was waiting inside that engine. The smell that would shatter his certainty and rebuild it into something stronger and humbler and more honest. But he didn't know that yet. Right now, he just felt cold and tired and scared of what his son's letter represented. The arrogance of certainty, the pride that came before understanding. I need to write to Tommy, Crawford said. I need to tell him something. But I don't know what yet. Morgan smiled, thin and sad. You'll know. After we open that engine, you'll know exactly what to tell him. They walked out together, the hangar doors rolling closed behind them with a sound like thunder made of metal. The La-7 sat alone in the darkness. Red stars invisible now. Secrets locked inside 1,700 pounds of radial engine. Secrets that tasted like medicine and childhood and being wrong about everything that mattered. Crawford went back to his quarters, small room, single bed, desk with a lamp. He sat down, pulled out paper and pen, started to write a letter to his son, then stopped. What could he say? Don't be confident. Don't trust your professors. Don't believe America is the best. None of that was right. The problem wasn't confidence. The problem was certainty without humility. The problem was pride without respect. The problem was thinking that different meant inferior. Crawford put the pen down, looked out the window at the base, lights glowing in the darkness, men sleeping, dreaming, living in a world where America had won the war, and that meant something about superiority and destiny and being chosen by history. Maybe they were right. Maybe America was the best. Or maybe the best was whatever worked, whatever solved the problem, whatever got men home alive from missions that should have killed them. Crawford thought about Morgan's words. Castor oil, medicine cabinet oil, used in the Great War, abandoned as primitive. But what if it wasn't primitive? What if it was just different? What if the Soviets had figured out something Americans had forgotten? He pulled Tommy's letter out again. Read it one more time. Felt his heart breaking a little bit. Not because his son was wrong to be proud, but because pride without wisdom was just arrogance waiting to be humbled. Crawford folded the letter carefully, put it back in his pocket. Tomorrow they would continue the examination. Day after tomorrow they would start disassembly. Day 7 they would open the engine. And on day 7 everything would change. The smell would hit him first. Sweet, medicinal, impossible. His mind would reject it. His hands would shake. His certainty would crack like ice under weight. Castor oil. Children's medicine in a Soviet fighter engine that helped defeat Nazi Germany. But that was still coming. Right now, Crawford was just a tired man in a small room trying to figure out how to teach his son the difference between confidence and arrogance when he was still learning it himself. He turned off the lamp, lay down on the bed, closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring more measurements, more documentation, more small revelations that the Soviet engineers knew exactly what they were doing. But the big revelation was still 5 days away, still locked inside that engine, still waiting to teach American pride the lesson it needed most, that sometimes the answer isn't in the future. Sometimes it's in the past, used differently, applied smarter, optimized for conditions nobody else considered. Crawford fell asleep thinking about bacon and coffee and abundance, about Tommy's letter and Professor Henderson's lectures and the certainty that came from never being tested. And in Hangar 7, the La-7 sat silent in the darkness, patient, holding its secrets, waiting for day 7 when American engineers would drain the oil and breathe in that smell and have every assumption destroyed in the space between heartbeats. The smell of medicine, the smell of genius, the smell of being wrong about everything that mattered and learning to be grateful for the lesson. But that was still coming. For now, there was only darkness and cold and the quiet sound of wind moving across an airfield where yesterday's enemies had become today's teachers, if anyone was humble enough to listen. Day 7 began with the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of bacon hitting hot griddles in the mess hall. Crawford sat at the same corner table, same plate of eggs and crispy bacon, same black coffee, steaming in the cold morning air. But everything felt different. 6 days of examining the La-7 had created cracks and certainties he'd held for 20 years. Small cracks. Hairline fractures in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about engineering. Today, those cracks would become canyons. Today, they would open the engine. The team assembled in the mess hall, Hayes eating oatmeal like a man going to surgery, Stein picking at scrambled eggs, his mind already in the hangar, Derek with a stack of pancakes drowning in syrup, but the confidence from day 1 was gone, replaced with something quieter, more careful. Morgan arrived last, just coffee, black. He sat down across from Crawford and didn't say anything for a long time. Just watched the younger men eat, watched them prepare themselves for something they didn't know was coming. Today's the day, Crawford said. Morgan nodded. You ready for it? Crawford thought about that question. Ready for what? Ready to confirm American superiority, ready to document Soviet inferiority, ready to write a report that would make Washington happy and secure his career, or ready to learn he'd been wrong. I don't know what I'm ready for, Crawford admitted. Morgan smiled that thin, sad smile. Good, that's the right answer. Mitchell arrived at 06:45, stood at the head of the table where the team had gathered. He looked tired, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. The weight of 14 days pressing down on his shoulders. 7 days gone. 7 days left. "Gentlemen," Mitchell said, "today we extract the engine. Today we see what's really inside this machine. This is what Washington is waiting for. This is what matters." He paused, looked at each man individually. "Document everything. Photograph everything. Every measurement, every observation, every detail. We get one chance at this. Let's not waste it." The walk to Hangar 7 felt longer than usual. November wind cutting through coats, breath visible in cold air. The sun climbing slowly, burning off frost, illuminating the red stars on wings that had flown over Berlin in the last days of Nazi Germany. Inside the hangar, the temperature was barely warmer than outside. Someone had brought in portable heaters, but they weren't doing much against the Ohio cold. The La-7 waited on its analysis stand, engine cowling, already removed the massive radial engine, visible like a mechanical heart exposed to daylight. 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, cooling fins catching light, oil stains on metal, the smell of grease and fuel, and something else Crawford still couldn't identify. Something sweet, something wrong. Crawford set his coffee cup down on a workbench, rolled up his sleeves despite the cold. This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. The team worked methodically through the morning, disconnecting fuel lines, removing ignition wiring, unbolting accessories, each component documented before removal, each connection photographed, each measurement recorded in notebooks that would become classified reports read by men in Pentagon offices who had never touched an engine in their lives. The propeller came off first. 3 blades of polished metal, variable pitch mechanism exposed, hydraulic actuation driven by oil pressure, no backup electric system, just oil pressure in a spring-loaded failsafe. Simple, reliable, field maintainable. Derek examined the pitch change mechanism, ran his fingers over the machining. The tolerances were tight, tighter than they needed to be for the simple design. Someone had cared about this. Someone had taken pride in making it right. "Okay," Derek said quietly. "This is actually smart. Redundancy through simplicity instead of complexity." It was the first time he'd said anything positive in 2 days. The magnetos came next, 2 of them. Iskrovniki in Russian. Similar to American scintilla designs, but housed in casings that looked overbuilt. Massive metal shells, way heavier than they needed to be. Why so heavy, Hayes wondered aloud. Stein measured the casing thickness, then he understood. Protection. These things are designed to survive crash landings, getting shot, field damage. They're not optimized for weight. They're optimized for not breaking. Crawford made notes. Every choice has a reason. Every design decision answers a question. The question is, what questions were they asking? Lunch came at noon, sandwiches and chips brought in from the mess hall. The teammates standing up, not wanting to leave the hangar, not wanting to break momentum. Coca-Cola in glass bottles, cold and sweet. American abundance that nobody commented on, but everyone noticed. By 1300 hours, they were ready for the main event. Extracting the engine from the airframe, the specialized hoist rolled into position. Heavy steel crane rated for 2 tons. The ASH-82FN engine weighed 880 kilograms. 1,940 pounds of aluminum and steel and secrets. Crawford supervised the attachment points. 4 eyes welded to the crankcase specifically for lifting. The Soviets had thought of that too, had made removal easier, had designed for maintenance from the start. The cable tightened, the hoist groaned. Slowly, carefully, the engine began to separate from its mounts. 12 massive bolts holding 1,700 pounds of machinery. Crawford had checked the torque on each one. Perfect. Not over tight, not loose. Exactly right. The engine hung in the air, swaying slightly. Oil dripping from somewhere. Dark drops hitting the concrete floor with soft sounds that echoed in the cold hangar. 20 minutes to clear the airframe, threading it past structural members. Around control cables, through openings that seemed too small until you understood the geometry. Someone who knew what they were doing had designed this installation. The engine settled onto the analysis stand, massive steel frame with adjustable supports. They secured it carefully, bolted it down, positioned it so they could rotate it to any angle. Access any component. Crawford walked around it slowly. This was his domain. Engines, power plants, the mechanical hearts that turned fuel into flight. He'd designed them, built them, tested them, certified them for war production. But he'd never seen anything quite like this. The ASH-82 FN radial, 14 cylinders, 1,850 horsepower, 2.1 horsepower per kilogram. Numbers that match the best American engines. Numbers that shouldn't be possible with the crude materials and limited manufacturing the Soviets supposedly had. Tomorrow we start internal examination, Mitchell said. Tonight get some rest. We've got 7 days left, and this is where the real work begins. But Crawford stayed. After the others left, after the hangar grew quiet, he stood there in the cold looking at the engine and felt that strange anticipation again. Like standing on the edge of something. Like waiting for a storm that hadn't arrived yet but was coming. Coming soon. Day 8 started the same way. Coffee and bacon. But Crawford couldn't taste either one. His mind was already in the hangar. Already circling that engine. Already asking questions he didn't have answers for. The first cylinder came off at 0900 hours. 12 bolts, simple hand tools, 5 minutes to remove. The cylinder lifted away cleanly, revealing the piston inside. Hayes examined the cylinder walls, took measurements, checked for wear. His face showed confusion. This engine has hundreds of hours on it, Hayes said. Combat hours, hard use. But the cylinder wear is minimal. The honing marks are still visible. That shouldn't be possible. Stein looked through a magnifying glass at the cylinder bore. The metal showed almost no scoring, no significant wear. Something was protecting these surfaces better than it should. Crawford extracted the piston, held it up to the light. Aluminum alloy, precisely machined. But something was wrong, or right, or different in a way that changed everything. 2 rings, Crawford said slowly. Just 2 compression rings, no oil control ring. The team gathered closer. Derek stared. That's impossible. Without an oil control ring, this engine should smoke like a chimney, should burn oil by the gallon, should foul spark plugs every few hours. But it doesn't, Stein said. The exhaust stacks show minimal oil burning. We documented that on day 2. Hayes pulled out his notebook, flipped through pages, found the entry, confirmed. Exhaust analysis showed normal oil consumption, well within acceptable limits. So how, Derek asked, how does it work without an oil control ring? Crawford turned the piston slowly in his hands, looked at the 2 rings, thought about everything they'd learned in 6 days of examination. Every choice has a reason. Every design answers a question. What if, Crawford said slowly, what if the oil doesn't need controlling? What if the oil behaves in a way that makes the 3rd ring unnecessary? The hangar went quiet. Morgan's voice came from the back where he had been watching. What kind of oil behaves that way? Crawford looked at him. I don't know, but we're about to find out. They broke for lunch. Fried chicken from the mess hall, crispy, hot, mashed potatoes and gravy, green beans, corn, apple pie for dessert. The smells filled the corner of the hangar where they'd set up a makeshift break area. Morgan sat down with his plate, took a bite of chicken, watched the younger men eat. You know what this reminds me of, Morgan said. Crawford looked up. What American abundance. We take it for granted. Hot food, fresh coffee, every single day. We won the war and came home to this. Stein pushed his potatoes around. Soviet engineers designed this engine while starving, while their factories were being bombed, while half their country was occupied. They used what they had, Hayes said, and made it work better than it had any right to. Derek had been quiet all morning. Now he spoke, his voice different than it had been a week ago. Smaller, more honest. I've been an ass, Derek said. I came here thinking I knew everything, thinking my professors knew everything, thinking American engineering was automatically superior just because it's American. He set his fork down. But confidence without humility isn't confidence. It's just arrogance waiting to be humbled. Crawford felt something shift in his chest, felt pride mixed with recognition. Derek was learning, growing, becoming the kind of engineer America actually needed instead of the kind engineering schools were producing. The afternoon of day 8 moved faster, more components removed, more measurements taken, more mysteries uncovered. The oil pump was massive, Oversize for the engine displacement. Capacity of 80 liters per minute. Way more than necessary for normal oil. Unless the oil was thicker than normal. Unless it needed more pressure to move through the system. Unless the entire engine was designed around oil properties that American engineers had forgotten existed. Day 9 started with rain. Cold November rain that turned the base into mud and made the walk to Hangar 7 miserable. But inside under the lights, the work continued. Today, they would drain the oil. Standard procedure before internal examination. Drain the crankcase. Collect the oil. Analyze it for metal particles. Check for contamination. Assess the condition of internal components based on what came out when you pulled the drain plug. Crawford had done this 1,000 times. Pulled drain plugs on Pratt & Whitney engines. Wright Cyclones, Allison V12s. Every engine leaked its secrets into the oil. Metalware, bearing particles. The story of internal health written in dark fluid that smelled like petroleum and heat and mechanical stress. He positioned the drain pan, large metal container, clean, ready to catch whatever came out. The drain plug was at the lowest point of the crankcase. Massive hex bolt, 24 mil in bottom. American standard would be 15/16. Close, but not quite the same. Crawford fitted the wrench, applied pressure. The bolt was tight, 880 kilograms of engine weight pressing down. But it gave, started to turn, threading out slowly. The team had gathered around, watching, waiting for oil to flow, waiting for the color and consistency to tell them about the engine's condition, waiting for confirmation of what they expected to find. Crawford turned the bolt. 1 rotation, 2, 3, almost there, almost out, last few turns, hand tight now. The bolt came free. Crawford pulled it clear of the threads, and that's when everything changed. Oil began to flow. Dark, thick, sluggish in the cold hangar air. Normal so far. Expected. Standard. Then the smell hit. Crawford froze. Wrench in one hand, drain plug in the other, his entire body going rigid as his brain tried to process what his nose was telling him. That smell. Sweet. Medicinal. Impossible. Childhood memories flooding back. Being 8 years old, sick with flu. His mother standing over him with a spoon. That terrible taste. That unforgettable smell. This will help Bobby. Old remedies work best. Castor oil? The wrench slipped from Crawford's fingers, hit the concrete with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet hangar. Hayes stepped closer, wrinkled his nose. Bob, what is that smell? Stein inhaled. Frowned. That's not engine oil. That's something else. Derek moved around to see better. Smells like medicine. Like something from a pharmacy. Crawford stood frozen. The oil was pooling in the drain pan now. Dark and thick and wrong. Everything was wrong. This couldn't be. This was impossible. This violated every principle of modern engine design. Every advancement since 1920. Every reason they'd moved away from plant-based oils to petroleum synthetics. His hands were shaking. He reached down, dipped his finger in the flowing oil, rubbed it between thumb and forefinger, brought it close to his nose. 20 years of engineering knowledge collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. Crawford's voice came out barely audible. Castor oil. Silence. Complete silence except for oil dripping into the pan. Derek laughed nervously. That's not funny, Crawford. Crawford looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide, his voice stronger now, louder, more certain and more horrified at the same time. It's castor oil, Ricinus communis, the same oil they give to children for constipation, the same oil we stopped using in engines in 1920. It's castor oil, and this whole engine runs on it. Hayes took a step back. That's impossible. Castor oil can't work in a high-compression engine. It oxidizes too fast. It gums up. It requires constant changing. It's primitive. It's obsolete. It works, Morgan said quietly from behind them. I flew on it. 1917. 1918. Gnome rotary engines. Castor oil. It was crude. It leaked everywhere. It smelled terrible. Morgan moved closer, looked down at the oil pooling in the pan. But it worked. Got me through 47 missions over France. Brought me home alive when half my squadron died. Derek's voice went up an octave. But those were primitive engines, low compression, low RPM. This is 1945. This is 1,850 horsepower. This is high compression, high stress, modern fighter engine. Castor oil can't. Crawford held up his oil-stained hand. His voice cut through Derek's panic like a blade. But it does. It does work. The evidence is right here. This engine flew hundreds of combat missions. The cylinder wear is minimal. The bearing surfaces are protected. Everything works. He looked at his team, at their shocked faces, at the certainty draining out of them like oil from a crankcase. We need to understand why Crawford said. We need to understand how. Get this to the lab. Full chemical analysis. I want results in 2 hours. Mitchell had been standing in the doorway. Nobody knew how long he had been there. His face was stone. Crawford Mitchell said, "Tell me you're wrong. Tell me this is some kind of mistake." Crawford shook his head. "No mistake, sir. This is castor oil. Soviet fighters run on medicine cabinet oil. And somehow, impossibly, it works better than what we're using." Mitchell turned and walked out without another word. The lab analysis came back at 1,500 hours. A young chemist delivered the report personally. His hands shook slightly as he handed the folder to Crawford. The results were unambiguous. 95% castor oil, 5% phenolic additives for oxidation resistance, trace metals consistent with normal engine wear. But those trace amounts were remarkably small. This oil was protecting the engine components with unusual effectiveness. Mitchell called an emergency meeting. The entire team, conference room adjacent to the hangar. Coffee had been made, but nobody was drinking it. "Someone explain to me how this is possible," Mitchell said. Derek stood up, his face red, his voice loud. "It's not possible. They're using it because they're backward, because they can't make synthetic oil. It's proof of Soviet inferiority, not sophistication." Crawford stayed seated, kept his voice calm. "Then why does the engine work so well?" Derek slammed his hand on the table. "Luck. Dumb luck. One successful design doesn't prove anything." Stein pulled out his metallurgy reports. "Derek, the cylinder wear is minimal. This oil protected components under extreme combat stress. That's not luck. That's chemistry." Hayes spread his documentation across the table. The combat record shows hundreds of sorties per aircraft. Rough field conditions, Arctic cold, desert heat. These engines kept running, kept performing. That's not coincidence. Derek's voice cracked. "You're all buying Soviet propaganda. They're primitive. We won. We built better. This castor oil proves they couldn't match our synthetic oils." Morgan stood slowly. His chair scraped against the floor. The room went quiet. "Son," Morgan said, his voice soft but heavy with authority. "I'm going to tell you something about being wrong." He walked to the window, looked out at the rain. "In the Great War, I flew Sopwith camels, rotary engines, castor oil. We thought we were modern, advanced, best in the world." Morgan turned back to face the room. "After the war, we moved to radial engines, petroleum oil. We abandoned castor oil, called it primitive, obsolete, beneath us." He paused. "The Germans thought the Soviets were primitive, called their tanks crude, called their planes farmers' tools. Then 300,000 Germans died at Stalingrad. Then Army Group Center got destroyed at Bagration. Then Berlin fell." Morgan looked directly at Derek. "You know what primitive means? It means we don't understand it yet. It means we're too arrogant to see the genius in approaches different from our own." Derek sat down slowly, the red draining from his face, replaced by something paler, something that looked like shame mixed with recognition. Mitchell stood up. "Crawford, I want to know why castor oil works. I want experts. I want data. I want answers. We have 6 days left." Crawford nodded. "I know someone. Professor William Patterson, MIT Chemistry, best lubricants researcher in America. He can tell us." "Get him here," Mitchell said, "whatever it costs." The meeting ended. The team dispersed slowly. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what they were all thinking, that they'd been wrong, completely, fundamentally, wrong about everything. Crawford stayed in the conference room, alone, staring at the lab report. 95% castor oil, the same oil his mother gave him as a child. The same oil that tasted terrible and worked perfectly. The same oil that powered Soviet fighters to victory over Berlin. He pulled out Tommy's letter. Read it again. We Americans build better because we think better. Crawford folded the letter carefully, put it back in his pocket, sat there in the empty conference room, and tried to figure out how to tell his son that thinking better didn't mean thinking the same. That building better depended on the question you were asking. That American superiority wasn't automatic, wasn't guaranteed, wasn't a birthright. It had to be earned, proven, defended with evidence and humility and the willingness to learn from anyone, even enemies, even rivals, even farmers who built fighters from wood and castor oil and genius. The rain kept falling outside, cold November rain that would turn to snow soon. Winter coming, the war over, a new world emerging where yesterday's certainties became tomorrow's embarrassments. Crawford stood up, walked back to the hangar. The La-7 sat on its stand, engine exposed, oil drained, secrets revealed but not yet understood. He touched the red star on the cowling, felt the cold metal under his palm. Tomorrow Professor Patterson would arrive. Tomorrow they would begin to understand. Tomorrow the science would explain what Crawford's nose had already told him. That castor oil wasn't primitive, wasn't obsolete, wasn't a compromise or a fallback or a sign of technological backwardness. It was optimal for the conditions, for the constraints, for the questions Soviet engineers were asking while their country burned and their families died and their factories were bombed into rubble. They'd asked, what can we actually make? What will actually work? What will keep our pilots alive? And they'd found answers American engineers had forgotten existed. Crawford walked out of the hangar. The rain soaked through his coat immediately, cold and miserable. He didn't care. He needed to walk, needed to think, needed to process what the next 6 days would bring. Understanding, humility, respect, and a letter to his son that would be harder to write than any engineering report. Harder because it required admitting he'd been wrong, that his certainty had been arrogance, that the Soviet engineers weren't inferior. They were just solving different problems, better than Americans had solved them, with less, with worse, with nothing but ingenuity and castor oil and the desperate creativity that comes from fighting for survival. The rain kept falling, Crawford kept walking, and in Hangar 7 the oil kept dripping from that massive radial engine. Dark drops on concrete, each one carrying secrets, each one smelling of medicine and genius and the price of being wrong. Tomorrow would bring answers, science, data, proof. But Crawford already knew the truth, had known it the moment that smell hit his nose, the moment his childhood memories collided with his engineering pride. America wasn't automatically the best. America had to learn, had to listen, had to respect. Even when the teacher was an enemy, even when the lesson tasted like medicine, even when the truth smelled like everything you'd been taught to dismiss as primitive. Crawford reached his quarters, soaked, cold, changed. He sat down at his desk, pulled out paper and pen, started to write. Dear Tommy, then stopped. What could he say? How could he explain? How could a father teach his son that everything the professor said was half-truth at best? Crawford put the pen down. Tomorrow, he'd write tomorrow, after Patterson arrived, after the science confirmed what his nose already knew, after he fully understood the lesson himself. Only then could he teach it to his son. He lay down on his bed, closed his eyes, tried to sleep, but all he could smell was castor oil. Sweet, medicinal, impossible. The smell of genius hiding in plain sight. The smell of answers everyone had stopped asking questions about. The smell of Soviet engineers solving American problems better than Americans had. And that smell would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. And that changed everything. Professor William Patterson arrived on day 10 in a car that looked older than most of the engineers examining it. 67 years old, white hair combed straight back, bow tie under his wool coat, 2 leather suitcases full of equipment that clinked and rattled as he carried them into Hangar 7. Crawford met him at the entrance, shook his hand, felt the strength still in those old fingers. Fingers that had spent 40 years handling chemicals and lubricants and the molecular secrets of friction. Professor Crawford said, Thank you for coming on short notice. Patterson set down his suitcases, looked past Crawford at the La-7 sitting on its stand, engine exposed, oil stains on concrete beneath it. You told me Soviet fighters run on castor oil, Patterson said. I told you that was impossible. You said come see for yourself. Crawford gestured toward the engine. The evidence is right there. We drained it 3 days ago. Chemical analysis confirmed. 95% castor oil. And the engine works perfectly, better than it should. Patterson walked closer, knelt down beside the drain pans still sitting under the engine, dipped his finger in the remaining oil, rubbed it between his fingers, brought it to his nose. His eyes widened. My God, you're right. He stood up slowly, looked at Crawford with something between respect and disbelief. Do you understand what this means? Patterson asked. Do you understand the implications? Crawford shook his head. That's why you're here, to help us understand. Patterson spent the rest of day 10 setting up his laboratory in the corner of the hangar. Bunsen burners, glass beakers, viscosity testing equipment, temperature-controlled baths, chemical analysis tools that looked like they belonged in a university rather than a military hangar. The team watched him work. Precise, methodical, every movement practiced from decades of experience. This was a man who knew his craft, who understood lubricants at a level that made engine designers look like children playing with blocks. By evening, Patterson had his first results. He called the team together, set up a chalkboard, drew molecular diagrams that most of them didn't fully understand but respected anyway. Gentlemen, Patterson began, I've spent 40 years studying lubricants, petroleum oils, synthetic compounds, additives, molecular structures. I thought I knew everything there was to know. He tapped the chalkboard. This castor oil has reminded me that knowledge and wisdom are different things. We abandoned castor oil because we could afford better. But we never asked if better meant better for all conditions, just better for our conditions. Hayes raised his hand. What makes castor oil different? Patterson drew a long molecular chain on the board. Castor oil is primarily ricinoleic acid, long-chain fatty acid with a hydroxyl group right here. This creates molecular polarity. One end of the molecule is attracted to metal at the atomic level. He demonstrated with 2 metal plates, coated one with castor oil, coated one with synthetic petroleum oil, tilted both vertical. The synthetic oil ran off immediately. Left bare metal, the castor oil stayed, clung to the surface, refused to drip. This is adhesion, Patterson explained. The oil molecules bond to metal surfaces. They don't just sit on top, they attach. At temperatures up to 220 degrees Celsius, this bond holds. The metal never touches metal, even under extreme pressure, even under combat stress. Derek spoke up quietly. So cold starts. Patterson nodded. No dry metal contact, ever. The protective layer never fully leaves the surface. You could let this engine sit for a month in Arctic cold. Start it up. Zero wear during that critical first 30 seconds when most engine damage occurs. Stein leaned forward. But castor oil oxidizes, goes rancid. That's why we abandoned it. Patterson smiled. True, it requires changing every 25 hours instead of 50. But look at this. He showed temperature stability graphs, viscosity measurements across a range from -40 to +40 Celsius. Castor oil maintains protective viscosity across a much wider temperature range than petroleum synthetics. It works in Siberian winter and African summer. Same oil, no seasonal changes needed. And it doesn't thin dangerously at high temperatures like synthetics do. Crawford was making notes, writing everything down. His hand cramped from the pace, but he didn't stop. There's more, Patterson said. Castor oil doesn't mix with gasoline. If some oil gets past the compression rings into the combustion chamber, which happens in radial engines, it doesn't dissolve in the fuel. Doesn't weaken combustion, just burns separately. Clean, minimal carbon deposits. He pulled out microscope slides, showed samples of combustion chamber deposits. One from an American engine running synthetic oil, one from the La-7. The American engine showed thick carbon buildup, black, crusty, the kind of deposits that reduce efficiency and cause pre-ignition. The La-7 sample was nearly clean. Thin brown residue, minimal buildup. This engine could run longer between overhauls, Patterson said, not despite the castor oil. Because of it, the hangar was silent except for the sound of wind outside. Cold November wind that carried the promise of snow. Derek stood up. His voice was different now, smaller, honest. Professor Derek said, "Are you telling us that castor oil is superior to synthetic petroleum oils?" Patterson shook his head. I'm telling you it's superior for their air optimization criteria. The Soviets optimized for field maintenance, extreme temperatures, indigenous production, and combat reliability. For those criteria, castor oil is optimal. He paused. We optimized for depot maintenance, consistent climate control, petroleum supply chain logistics, and extended service intervals. For our criteria, synthetic oil is optimal. Patterson looked around the hangar, met each man's eyes. Neither choice is wrong. But dismissing their choice as primitive, that's the mistake. They asked different questions and found better answers to their questions than we found to ours. Mitchell had been listening from the doorway. He stepped forward now. Professor Mitchell said, "Tomorrow we present findings to Pentagon observers, 30 men, generals, industry leaders, academic experts. They're expecting us to confirm Soviet inferiority." What do we tell them? Patterson didn't hesitate. You tell them the truth, that Soviet engineers solved an impossible problem using a solution we had forgotten existed, that their approach to engineering under constraint is something we should study, not dismiss. That different doesn't mean inferior. Mitchell nodded slowly. That's going to be a hard sell. Truth usually is, Patterson said. Day 11 was Thanksgiving. The base mess hall served turkey and stuffing and mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie. American abundance on full display. Men eating and laughing and being grateful for being alive, for being home, for being American. Crawford sat with his team. They ate mostly in silence. The contrast was too obvious to ignore. They were eating like kings while discussing engineers who designed a masterpiece while starving. Morgan finally broke the silence. You know what American means? Hayes looked up. What Morgan gestured at the feast around them. This. Abundance, having more than we need, being able to waste and not worry. That's the America we built, the America we fought for. He took a bite of turkey, chewed slowly. But there's another America too. The America of depression and Dust Bowl, of making do with less, of fixing what's broken instead of buying new, of ingenuity born from necessity. Morgan set down his fork. My father was a rancher in Texas, 1930s. Drought killed everything. We had nothing. But we survived, used what we had, found ways. That's American too. Maybe the most American thing there is. Stein spoke quietly. The Soviets showed us that kind of American. The kind we've forgotten because we don't need it anymore. Crawford looked at his plate. Turkey and all the trimmings. More food than one man needed. More than most of the world had. And somewhere in his memory, Soviet engineers bent over drafting tables in unheated factories, designing engines that would run on plant oil because petroleum was a luxury they couldn't afford. The meeting was scheduled for day 14, the last day, the deadline. Mitchell had arranged for the base conference hall, largest room on the facility, 30 chairs arranged in rows, coffee and donuts set up on tables in the back. By 0900 hours, everyone had arrived. 2 generals from Washington, 3 representatives from Pratt & Whitney, 2 from Wright Aeronautical. Allison Engine Company sent their chief engineer. Navy had observers, MIT sent professors, Caltech sent experts. Army Air Forces Command sent staff officers who took notes on everything. The room smelled like coffee and authority and the weight of decisions that would shape Cold War strategy. Mitchell opened the meeting, stood at a podium in front, spoke clearly, no hesitation. Gentlemen, Mitchell said, 14 days ago, we received a Soviet La-7 fighter. We expected to confirm their technological inferiority. Instead, we learned humility. Crawford will present our findings. Crawford walked to the podium, carried his notes. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering. This moment would define his career, define how America saw the Soviet Union, define whether the next 40 years were built on truth or comfortable lies. He set down his notes, looked out at 30 faces, some friendly, some skeptical, some already hostile. 2 weeks ago, Crawford began, I believed I understood aircraft engines. I've designed them, tested them, certified them for war production. I thought I knew what good engineering looked like. He paused. This Soviet fighter destroyed every assumption I held, not because it's better than American aircraft. In many ways, it's not. But because it reveals a completely different approach to engineering that works as well as ours under certain conditions. Sometimes better. Murmurs in the audience. Crawford continued. The La-7 operates at speeds up to 680 kilometers per hour at ground level, climbs 1,000 meters per minute, carries 320-millimeter cannons. These specifications match or exceed contemporary American fighters at low altitude. He showed photographs, combat record documentation, German pilot testimonies. It achieves these specifications using wood construction, fabric covering, and standard aviation gasoline. Crawford paused. Let the next words sink in properly. And castor oil. The room erupted, voices raised, chairs scraping. General Marcus Thornton stood up in the front row. You're telling me they use medicine in fighter engines, Thornton demanded. Yes, sir, Crawford said calmly. Thornton's face reddened. This is proof of backwardness. Proof they couldn't match our synthetic oils. Proof of Soviet inferiority. Hayes stood from his seat. Sir, with respect, that was our first conclusion. We were wrong. A Pratt & Whitney executive rose. We abandoned castor oil 25 years ago. It gums up, oxidizes, requires constant maintenance. Modern synthetics are superior in every way. Patterson walked to the front. His age and academic credentials gave him authority. The room quieted slightly. Gentlemen, Patterson said, I am Professor William Patterson, MIT Chemistry Department, 40 years studying lubricants and tribology. I came here skeptical. I am leaving convinced. He had brought his molecular diagrams, set them up on an easel. Castor oil possesses unique molecular structure. Ricinoleic acid with hydroxyl group creates polarity. The molecules bond to metal surfaces at atomic level. This creates a protective layer that cannot be removed by pressure, temperature, or time. Patterson demonstrated with his coated metal samples the dramatic difference between synthetic oil running off and castor oil adhering. At combat temperatures above 160 Celsius, petroleum synthetics lose viscosity dramatically. Castor oil maintains protective film strength to 220 Celsius. Under extreme stress, high RPM hard maneuvering, castor oil outperforms synthetics in metal protection. The Pratt & Whitney executive remains standing. We've invested millions in synthetic development. Our engines run 100 hours between overhauls. Exactly, Patterson said. For your applications, long-range bombers, high-altitude operations, peacetime depot, maintenance, synthetics are optimal. But if you operated from Arctic rough fields with minimally trained mechanics, Soviet choice becomes optimal. Stein added economic data. Castor oil is made from castor plants. Grows in southern USSR. Simple processing. No petroleum refineries required. When German army occupies oil fields, when refineries are bombed, when supply lines break, castor plants still grow. Oil still processes. Engines still run. Strategic independence in total war. Crawford could see minds changing. Slowly, reluctantly, but changing. Derek stood. He looked nervous but determined. His moment of redemption. Sirs, Derek said. I'm Derek Williams, 26, MIT graduate. I came here convinced Soviet engineering was primitive. He paused, swallowed. I need to say publicly I was completely wrong. Not because Soviet engineering matches ours, but because I was measuring it by the wrong standards. Derek went to the chalkboard, wrote 2 columns, American optimization goals, maximum absolute performance, long service intervals, depot maintenance, petroleum supply chain, Soviet optimization goals, reliable battlefield performance, field repairable, indigenous materials, survive worst conditions. Castor oil fails by our metrics, Derek said, succeeds perfectly by theirs. I called them backward, but they were asking different questions. Better questions for their reality. General Thornton stood again. His tone had changed, less hostile, more thoughtful. Let me understand the implications, Thornton said. The Soviets built 5,700 advanced fighters using materials independent of petroleum. designed for minimal training mechanics, in factories being bombed. And they work. Yes, sir, Crawford confirmed. Thornton was quiet for a long moment. Then we've been underestimating them since 1941. The room went silent. Thornton continued. I came expecting confirmation of Soviet inferiority. Instead, I'm learning their engineering philosophy might be more resilient than ours in total war. That changes strategic assessment. That changes Cold War planning. That changes everything. Morgan stood from the back row. May I add something? Mitchell nodded. Morgan walked slowly to the front. 52 years old, but carrying the weight of two wars, two different conflicts. Same lessons learned at terrible cost. I flew in the Great War, Morgan said, on castor oil engines. Gnome and Larone rotaries, they were crude, leaked oil into the cockpit. I flew home smelling like a medicine cabinet every mission. He paused. Let memories surface. But they got me through 47 missions, through storms, through combat, through mechanical failures that should have killed me. In 1920, we abandoned castor oil, called it primitive, moved to petroleum synthetics. We were right to do so for our context, our needs, our optimization criteria. Morgan looked around the room. But Soviets asked different questions. They looked at old technology and asked, can we use these properties differently? They didn't go backward. They went sideways, found alternate path to same goal. That's not primitiveness. That's creativity under constraint. That's ingenuity. That's doing more with less. He paused again. His voice grew softer, but somehow more powerful. And those are American values too. My father was a Texas rancher. Dust Bowl years. We had nothing. But we survived, used what we had, fixed what broke, made do, found ways. That's American spirit, not just abundance. Also, resourcefulness. Morgan looked directly at the generals. Soviets showed us that spirit isn't uniquely ours. Other people can be resourceful too, can innovate too, can be smart too. That doesn't diminish us. That should humble us. Make us better. Make us respect opponents instead of underestimating them. The room stayed quiet after Morgan finished. Men thinking, reconsidering, understanding that this wasn't just about oil or engines. This was about how America would approach the next 40 years. Mitchell stood. Our recommendation is clear. Establish permanent technical intelligence analysis for Soviet engineering. Assessed by their optimization criteria, not ours. Study their approaches to constraint. Apply lessons where relevant, and most importantly, never underestimate capability based on different methodology. General Thornton nodded slowly. I'll ensure these recommendations reach Joint Chiefs. This briefing stays classified, but the lessons get incorporated into strategic planning. The meeting ended at 1400 hours. Men filed out slowly, conversations in small groups, coffee refilled, donuts ignored. Too much to think about. Too many assumptions overturned. Crawford found Derek outside, standing in the cold November air, looking at nothing. You did good in there, Crawford said. Derek shook his head. I've been an arrogant fool. My professors taught me to think American engineering was automatically superior. I believed it without questioning. You learned, Crawford said. That's what matters. That's what makes you a real engineer. Derek looked at him. I'm requesting transfer. Want to work permanent technical intelligence. Study more Soviet designs. Crawford extended his hand. I'll recommend you. We need engineers who can admit being wrong. They shook. American handshake. Respect earned through humility. Morgan found Crawford that evening. The hangar was empty now, just two old men and a Soviet fighter that had taught them both something they needed to learn. They sat on a workbench. Morgan pulled out a flask. Bourbon, American whiskey. They passed it back and forth in silence for a while. You going to write to your son, Morgan asked. Crawford nodded. Tonight, I know what to say now. Morgan took another sip. What's that? Crawford pulled out Tommy's letter, unfolded it one last time. Read the words he'd memorized. He's proud we're American, proud of American engineering. I want him to stay proud, but I need to teach him that pride without respect for others becomes arrogance. That confidence without humility becomes blindness. Morgan handed back the flask. That's a hard lesson. Crawford drank, felt the warmth spread through his chest. Best lessons usually are. That night, Crawford sat at his desk, pulled out clean paper, picked up his pen, started to write. Dear Tommy, I came to Ohio to study a Soviet fighter. Your professors would call it primitive. It's made of wood and fabric, uses oil from plants, needs changing twice as often as ours. But son, it works. It works better than our planes at the job it was designed for. Not because Soviets got lucky, because they thought differently than us. We asked, how do we make the best possible machine? They asked, how do we make the best machine we can actually build and maintain? Both questions are valid, but thinking only your question is valid. That's not confidence, Tommy. That's arrogance. Germans were arrogant, thought Soviet weapons were crude. Then they lost. I want you proud of American engineering. I am. But pride without respect for others becomes blindness. The engineer who thinks he has nothing to learn has stopped being an engineer. I love you. Come home at Christmas. We'll have apple pie and coffee, and I'll tell you about a plane that taught your father humility. Love, Dad. Crawford sealed the letter, addressed it, set it aside for morning mail. Felt lighter somehow, like he'd passed on something important. Something Tommy needed to hear before the world taught him the hard way. Day 15 brought unexpected visitors. Captain Jerzy Kowalski arrived with a translator, the Polish pilot who'd flown the La-7 over, who'd chosen freedom, who'd given America this teacher disguised as a fighter plane. Kowalski was thin, haunted eyes, 35 years old but looked 50. War did that to men. Through the translator, Kowalski spoke to the assembled team. I flew La-7 for Soviet Air Force, Polish squadron. We fought together against fascists. When war ended, I chose freedom, chose West, brought this plane as thank you gift to America. He paused, looked at the La-7 sitting quietly in the hangar. You studied it, you learned from it. This makes me happy. During war, I hated Soviets. They occupied my country, but I hated Germans more. In La-7, it kept me alive. 47 missions. Morgan stepped forward. The same number, 47 missions in the Great War. The coincidence wasn't lost on anyone. What will you do now? Morgan asked. Kowalski smiled slightly. Texas, maybe. They say Polish pilots can work on ranches. I rode horses in Poland before war. Maybe I ride again in Texas. Morgan extended his hand. Captain, I know ranchers in Texas. I'll write letters, make introductions. Kowalski shook his hand. Thank you. America is generous. Morgan's voice was gentle. America recognizes courage and skill. You brought us a teacher. That's a gift worth repaying. They stood there, former enemies, new friends, the American dream working the way it was supposed to, war fading into history. Peace-building bridges between men who'd pointed guns at each other months before. Crawford watched and understood something fundamental. Engineering wasn't about machines, it was about people, about learning from anyone willing to teach, about respect transcending politics and nationality and the accidents of birth. The La-7 was shipped to a museum in December, crated carefully, documentation sealed in classified folders. The report went to Washington, 247 pages. Most of it would stay secret for 50 years. But the lessons spread quietly, through officers who read it, through engineers who heard whispers, through teachers who understood something important had been learned in that Ohio hangar. Don't underestimate opponents. Don't assume different means inferior. Learn from everyone. Best idea wins regardless of source. American values, after all. Crawford went home for Christmas. Tommy came back from Purdue. They sat at the kitchen table eating apple pie and drinking coffee and talking about engineering. Dad, Tommy said, I got your letter. My professor said you were wrong about the Soviets. What did you say? Crawford asked. Tommy smiled. I said my father taught me that being wrong is how you learn to be right, and that any professor who thinks he has nothing to learn probably has the most to learn. Crawford felt pride swell in his chest. That's my boy. Years passed. Crawford retired. Tommy became a professor himself, taught engineering history, always started his classes with the story of the La-7 and the castor oil secret. The Cold War continued, but American strategists who'd read Crawford's report approached it differently. With respect, with caution, without the fatal underestimation that had cost Germany everything. Sputnik launched in '57, Americans were shocked, but some remembered the La-7 lesson. Remembered that Soviet engineers could do remarkable things with limited resources. The shock led to investment, to education, to the space program that eventually put men on the moon. Cuba 62, missile crisis. Kennedy's advisors remembered the La-7, remembered not to underestimate Soviet capability. Caution prevented catastrophe. Crawford died in 75. Thanksgiving Day, surrounded by family. Tommy held his hand at the end. "You taught me good lessons, Dad," Tommy whispered. Crawford smiled. "The La-7 taught me. I just passed them on." Decades later in 2020, Crawford's grandson Michael found the declassified report in National Archives. Read his grandfather's words. Felt connection across 75 years. Michael worked at SpaceX, designing reusable rockets, using the same philosophy. Simplicity, reliability, optimal solutions for actual constraints rather than theoretical perfection. He shared the report with his team. They recognized themselves in it, recognized that the lessons of 1945 were still relevant, still true, still necessary. Engineering serves function, not fashion. Best solution depends on the question being asked. Different approaches deserve respect, not dismissal. Learn from everyone. American values, Soviet values, human values. The La-7 sits in a museum now. Restored, beautiful. Red stars bright on silver wings. A plaque explains its history, its victories, its gift to American understanding. But the real gift wasn't the plane. It was the lesson, the humility, the recognition that genius doesn't belong to any one nation or ideology or approach. It belongs to whoever asks the right questions and has the courage to pursue unfashionable answers. Crawford understood that on day 9 when castor oil dripped from an engine and shattered his certainty, when the smell of medicine became the smell of wisdom. When childhood memories collided with engineering pride and taught him that the best remedies are often the old ones. Used differently, applied smarter, respected despite being unfashionable. The lesson remains. 75 years later, still relevant, still necessary, still waiting for the next generation of engineers to learn it. That confidence without humility is arrogance. That different isn't inferior. That the answer isn't always in tomorrow. Sometimes it's in yesterday. Used with genius and necessity and the desperate creativity of people doing more with less. Soviet engineers taught that lesson using plant oil and wood and fabric in the rubble of a country torn apart by war. American engineers learned it using bacon and coffee and the abundance that almost made them forget that resourcefulness matters more than resources. Both sides were right. Both sides were teachers. Both sides were students. That's the real American value, the willingness to learn from anyone, anywhere, anytime, even from enemies who became teachers, who gave America a gift wrapped in red stars and castor oil and the smell of medicine that became the smell of wisdom. The lesson endures. The La-7 waits. The story continues. And somewhere in a hangar that no longer exists, the ghost of that November morning remains. Cold air, coffee smell, oil dripping, certainty shattering, understanding dawning. The moment American engineering learned humility and became better for it.